Aloha, this is Cletus Correa. This is my presentation for Geography 335. I'm going to be talking to you about the militarization in Guam. The U.S. military has been ramping up their presence on the island as of late. It's been causing a little bit of controversy over there, actually quite a lot. Quite a few people are in favor of it, and of course there are some that are against it. It's nothing new in a way. The U.S. has been there for a very long time. And in fact, a lot of people aren't aware of this. I'm surprised that the U.S. Navy actually ruled Guam between 1898 and 1941. The Japanese took over, invaded in 1941, and towards the end of the war, around 1944, I believe, the U.S. came back into power in Guam, came back, took the island back from the Japanese, and ruled there again until 1950. So the U.S. Navy has had a long presence and history in Guam. The reason they're there is because the Spanish-American War, the United States, in their victory during the Treaty of Paris, got Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba from Spain as part of the booty, so to speak. And they wanted the harbor, is what they wanted. Philippines, of course, nearby, the Spanish used Guam as a stopping point for their galleons coming from Acapulco to the Philippines. The U.S. wanted it for the same reason, for a refueling station, and just to project their power into the Pacific and having a link to the Philippines. So, of course, there's a map of Guam. Guam, the first European to encounter, or the Chamorro people of Guam, was Ferdinand Magellan, who was sailing for Spain. Of course, in our readings we heard about the encounters they had with the Chamorros, not very good ones. In fact, Magellan called the islands Los Ladrones, which is Portuguese for the thieves, means the same thing in Spanish. So the encounters there weren't very good between the native Chamorros and the Spanish, as we found out in our readings. And there was some, what the Europeans called theft, basically misunderstandings, called the Chamorros thieves, named the island as such, and the island remained that on charts until actually the first U.S. governor, who I'm going to introduce you to soon, actually put a stop to that. So he did one good thing, but he didn't do a whole lot of good things. We'll get into that. The quote at the top there, less than a child, obstinately gentle, full of caprice, apparently wealthy and utterly poor, that was attributed to a U.S. journalist, I think in 1901, said that about the Chamorros of Guam. That's the kind of paternalistic attitude the U.S. took. All these poor people, we're going to be here to help them. What we're really interested in actually was the establishing a naval facility there. And basically what the U.S. did was when they turned it over to the Navy to run, they turned it into a huge military base, and they treated the Chamorros as they would sailors or Marines, or maybe sometimes less than that actually. The other picture, of course, you can see Uncle Sam balancing all his new gains, his new imperial power, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Guam still has ladrones on the flag over there, and you can see all the European powers admiring the new U.S. prowess in the Pacific. So this is the kind of attitude they have. You can see also how they portray indigenous peoples. It's very racist. Terrible things back in those days. Captain Richard Leary was the first commander assigned to Guam by President McKinley, and he set the tone, is why I'm going to be talking about him. In 41 years, that first 41 years of the Navy ruling Guam, there were 32 different governors. So much like ships, they kind of rotated captains or leaders fairly rapidly or often, and not a good thing. Like our presidents stay in power for at least 4 years. You want a continuity there, and it just lacked that. The others basically followed in Leary's footsteps. Some were a little more benevolent, and most weren't, to be honest. So Richard Leary, the reason I have these on the screens, it gives you a snapshot of the man. He's a Civil War veteran, so he's an old school Navy guy. Went to the U.S. Naval Academy, so he didn't come up from the ranks. He's an officer and a gentleman. He's taught to rule over his sailors very paternalistically, and that's what he's going to do to the Chamorros. The reason I have that he's a Protestant there is because the Chamorros are Catholic. Under the Spanish, they converted to Catholicism. It became a very important part of their culture and still is. The U.S. tried to change that, not successfully, but there was a culture clash there that I'll be getting into. Of course, I couldn't ignore his mustache. It's amazing. So how Leary went about this, he's not a civilian. He's not trained to run a civilian population at the Naval Academy. And the U.S. had no real bureaucracy, civilian bureaucracy to rule over these new colonies that they got from Spain, they in a way inherited. So Leary ran it the only way he knew how, by issuing general orders. But President McKinley wanted it to be more of a mission of altruism, and he said he was to win the confidence, respect, and affection of the inhabitants of the island of Guam by proving to them that the mission was one of benevolent assimilation. But that betrays the fact that the U.S. is not going to let things stay the way they have been under the Spanish. The new kid is in town, and they're going to change things. And Leary did that by general orders. I'll be covering a little bit about that, the way the Navy tried to force Americanization upon the Chamorros was mainly through the health and hygiene measures, suppressing Catholicism, and land reform. In health and hygiene measures, it doesn't seem like a very big thing, or in some ways the Navy spun it as an altruistic mission, but basically they told the Guamanians and made them feel inferior. Western medicine was thought by the Americans to be superior to the native health practices, so they banned a lot of that. They tried to force people to get licenses, and of course no one really got these licenses. But they also did oddly very racist things that in hindsight you can tell that the Americans thought they were better than the Chamorros. For instance, hookworm. There was a problem with hookworm infestations in Guam. And what the Navy did was, with their hospitals that they established, and they brought in hospital corpsmen and doctors, they would examine Chamorro school children annually. And actually not an examination, really they would inoculate them. They would treat them for the hookworm, whether they had it or not. And this was different for the Navy and Marine Corps personnel there. They would be examined first. It would be determined if they actually had a hookworm infection, and then they would be treated if necessary. So you can see already they're considering the Chamorros are dirty. They're running around bare feet in the dirt. They must have hookworms. So they just treated them whether they had it or not. So one of the measures that they used, it kind of controlled people's bodies in a way. They also told the women that they couldn't wear the long skirts that they've been wearing for traditionally for many years. They're called mestizas, these long skirts, and these skirts would drag up dust as they walked along the streets. Excuse me. And they blamed the hookworm infestations on this. Catholicism, as I said before, was a major part of the Chamorro lifestyle and their traditions and culture after the Spanish took over. The U.S. Didn't like that. Basically, the previous Spanish administration was pretty weak, and the Catholic Church basically was running Guam. And there were 3 Catholic priests there that were Spanish. There was only one Chamorro priest that was available on the island. He was the first and only Chamorro priest up until present day, I think. And they basically expelled the Spanish Catholic priests, put them on a ship, sent them to Manila, and from there back to Spain. Leary also ordered that all crosses be taken down from government offices, and actually one of the things, it's tied into Catholicism, the fiestas that people celebrate in Guam. Still important to this day, and obviously Leary never ever effectively got rid of it. The practice came back. But the fiestas, all the saints' feast days that the Guamanians, the Chamorros celebrate, were banned. And the reason actually that Leary did this was because the garrison needed food. And the Chamorros worked primarily, they were subsistence farmers, and they worked on what they called lanchas, which is Spanish for ranch, but that was a farm basically. And every time a fiesta happened, which is very often, they would stop work. And he didn't like that at all. He wanted the food for his garrison. He also banned food exports, by the way. So he was very heavy-handed in his rule. And finally, in land reform, they tried. The U.S. government wanted, the Navy wanted to of course appropriate the land on Guam for their own purposes. So they wanted to survey the land, and they also wanted to buy up whatever they could of the prime real estate. And on the right there, I'm going to kind of get into Chamorro population, how they passively resisted the U.S. occupation of their territory. There was no guerrillas in the hills here. They didn't fight the Americans, but they did resist in their own way. And they're very good at it, very clever people. They simply sometimes just ignored regulations. They refused to go to hospital corpsmen sometimes, and the doctors, the U.S. Navy doctors, and went to their native health practitioners. With the work and the land reform, they would just refuse to work for Americans. The Americans weren't going to pay them very much. They were content with the lifestyle they had, so they just refused to work. And another thing I'm going to get into is the reverse surveillance. Basically, the Guamanians, the Chamorro people, would watch the Americans. The Americans were very good at watching the Chamorros. They had their kept an eye on them for all kinds of little minor infractions under these general orders that Leary implemented to try to assimilate them. And what he did was he set up something called the Insular Patrol, which were U.S. Marines. And eventually he stationed one Marine in every village on Guam. At least one Marine was there all the time. And they would have patrols go through. And ostensibly what they were doing was keep policing the area, making sure that people weren't doing petty crimes or murder or whatnot. But in reality what they were doing was they were looking to levy fines and to regulate the lives of Chamorros. So the Chamorros effectively were trying to reverse this surveillance, and what they did was the Insular Patrolmen would come through, and what they were looking for was they wanted all clothes hung on clotheslines to dry. The Chamorros previously had been just putting the clothes on their lawns to dry. The U.S. Navy didn't like that. That was unsanitary, is what they said. So the Marines would come around and hand out fines. They could fine you for having an unkempt lawn, all kinds of little, really manini small things. And so what the Chamorros did were the children would watch for these Marines, and they would warn their parents, you know, the Marines are coming. And they would know to go grab their laundry from outside and bring it in the house. They would put on footwear. That was another issue. They didn't like them running around barefoot. So the Chamorros would, you know, get their shoes on and slippers or whatnot. And this reverse surveillance worked really well. And it gave them some kind of measure that they were doing something. They're actively resisting the Americans. Well, a lot of terrible measures that the U.S. took. Some of the governors mellowed out in the future, but basically they wanted to force their way of life upon the Chamorro people. So as you can see, the militarization, that was just the start. A small garrison at that time, and it kept building and building. Still small before World War II, prior, but after World War II it just got ramped up as the Vietnam War occurred and all that kind of things happened in the Southeast Asia. The buildup continued. And with our loss of the bases in the Philippines, it's become even more of an issue. And as I was saying earlier, there are a lot of Chamorros who are in favor of this. A lot of them have served in the military, continue to serve in the U.S. Navy especially. And they like having their jobs and sending back remittances and taking care of their families. And a lot of the Guamanians, Chamorros, have jobs with the U.S. military or the Department of Defense. A lot of Filipinos are there, and a lot of them work for the U.S. as well. So there are people that like the U.S. presence there. They're actually rather patriotic when I was there. But there are people who are against the buildup as well. So that's both sides of the issue there. Very complicated, much more complicated in some ways than here in Hawaii. So that's pretty much what I have on the militarization of Guam. I appreciate you tuning in, and I want to say hafadai, which is how they say aloha in Chamorro. Thank you.